My name is Clara W. Harper, and I'm 30 years old. The night everything shifted didn't look dramatic from the outside. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no broken glasses or accusations echoing through the apartment. It was a quiet Sunday night. The TV was on, but muted, filling the room with a flickering blue light that made everything feel strangely distant. Caleb sat beside me on the couch, scrolling through his phone the way he always did when he wanted to avoid real conversations. We had been together a little over 2 years, living together for almost 1. From the outside, we looked stable. Friends called us solid, reliable, the couple that had already figured things out. Inside the apartment that night, though, something was shifting beneath the surface. I had been talking about a new project at work, something I had been excited about all week, when Caleb finally looked up from his phone. His expression was calm, almost rehearsed. "Can we talk about something?" he asked. There was something in his tone that made my stomach tighten. "Sure," I said. He leaned back against the couch, exhaling slowly like someone preparing to deliver a speech he had practiced many times before. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately." That sentence alone told me everything. People rarely start with those words unless they've already decided something. "I'm just not sure you're the woman I want right now," Caleb said. The way he said it was gentle, careful, like he believed the softness of his tone would somehow soften the meaning of the words themselves. I didn't speak immediately. Instead, I watched him. His posture relaxed the moment the sentence left his mouth, like someone finally putting down a heavy bag they'd been carrying. He continued before I could respond. "I mean, don't freak out," he said quickly. "I'm just being honest." Honest. That was Caleb's favorite word whenever he wanted to say something cruel without consequences. I finally asked the obvious question. "What does that mean?" He shrugged. "It just means I feel stuck lately. I need space to think, to figure out what I really want." He paused, then added the line that stung more than the rest. "You're great, Clara. Just maybe not enough for me right now." Enough. Another word people use when they want to reduce someone to a temporary option. I noticed how calm he looked, too calm. Like he had rehearsed this entire conversation in his head on the drive home from work. Or maybe during lunch. Maybe during one of those long lunches he had recently started taking with Sophie, the coworker he had once told me not to worry about. Something inside me went very still. "Okay," I said quietly. He blinked, surprised. "Okay? I understand," I repeated. Relief flooded across his face so quickly it was almost painful to watch. His shoulders dropped. He leaned toward me and kissed my cheek like we had just finished discussing weekend plans instead of the future of our relationship. "Thank you for being mature about this," he said. That was the moment I understood something important. Caleb believed maturity meant patience. Patience meant waiting. Waiting meant staying. And staying meant I would remain available while he figured out whether someone else might make him happier. What he didn't know, what I didn't say, was that waiting doesn't always mean standing still. Sometimes it means leaving quietly. The next morning felt strangely normal. Caleb woke up early for work like always. He rushed through his routine, complaining about traffic while tying his shoes near the door. He kissed my forehead on his way out. "Love you," he said automatically. The words sounded more like muscle memory than emotion. "Have a good day," I replied. The door closed behind him. Silence settled into the apartment. I stood in the kitchen for a long time just listening to that silence. Then I noticed his laptop. It was open on the counter. I wasn't snooping. It was simply there. A message notification appeared at the top of the screen. "Sophie." I recognized the name immediately. The message was short. "And can't believe you finally said it. About time." That was all it said. No emojis, no flirting. Just confirmation. A quiet acknowledgement that the conversation we had last night had already been discussed somewhere else. I didn't feel angry. I felt validated. So I started packing. Not dramatically. No trash bags. No throwing things across the room. Just my clothes, my laptop, my books, the few pieces of furniture that actually belonged to me. I skipped anything replaceable. I left the couch Caleb loved, the artwork he picked, the mugs filled with inside jokes that suddenly felt like lies. I forwarded my mail. Transferred my direct deposit to a different account. Called the landlord. As it turned out, my name had always been the primary one on the lease. Funny how those details work out. By noon, my car was full. Before leaving, I cleaned the apartment. Not for Caleb. For me. I hate chaos. When I finished, the space looked exactly the way it had when we first moved in. Like a life that had never quite started. I placed the key on the kitchen counter. No note. No explanation. Nothing for Caleb to argue with. Nothing he could twist into another conversation about honesty and space. My phone buzzed around 3:17 p.m. A message from him. "Hey, are you home?" I didn't answer. 10 minutes later, another message appeared. Clara, this isn't funny. I turned the phone face down on the passenger seat and started the engine. That was the moment I realized something clearly for the first time. Waiting doesn't mean pausing your life while someone else explores their options. Sometimes it means letting them discover what life looks like without you in it. And Caleb was about to learn that the woman he assumed would always stay had already left. Caleb noticed I was gone that night. I know because my phone lit up around 7:40 p.m. Like something inside his carefully managed world had suddenly caught fire. He never came home early unless he had a reason to, and that evening, apparently, I was the reason. The first few messages came fast. Where are you? Did you seriously leave? Clara, this is not what I meant. I read every one of them without replying, not because I wanted revenge, not because I was trying to punish him, but because I already understood something he still didn't. The moment I answered, he would try to pull the conversation back into his control. About an hour later, the tone shifted. Stop being dramatic. I said I needed space, not that we were breaking up. There it was, the reframing. The neat little trick of making my absence the problem instead of his uncertainty. I could almost hear his voice in the messages, calm on the surface, irritated underneath, like I had broken some unspoken agreement by reacting in a way he hadn't approved of. By midnight, the messages softened again. Can we talk tomorrow? I didn't think you'd actually do this. That sentence stayed with me longer than the others. Actually do this. Like leaving had only been theoretical. Like I was supposed to remain somewhere nearby, suspended in emotional storage until he was ready to make a final decision. That night, I stayed at a friend's place. I didn't tell her the full story. I only said that I needed to get out for a while, and she didn't push. Good friends understand that sometimes silence is its own form of kindness. I lay awake longer than I expected, staring at the ceiling, replaying the previous night in my mind. His face, his calmness. The way he said, "You're great," as if that should have made the rest of it easier to swallow. At some point, the hurt stopped feeling sharp and started feeling clear. There is a difference between someone being confused and someone quietly repositioning you while they test another possibility. And Caleb had not been confused. He had been preparing. The next morning, he texted me as if he could simply schedule my reaction around his day. I'm heading to work. We'll figure this out later. Later. Another soft word meant to keep me in orbit. Another way of saying, stay available while I decide what to do with you. I looked at that message for a long time before locking my phone and setting it aside. Something inside me had already settled. He had not broken up with me in the clean, honest way he wanted to pretend. He had demoted me, put me on pause, kept me on the bench while he figured out whether Sophie could become something more than a flirtation dressed up as friendship. By noon, I blocked his number. Not forever. Just long enough to breathe without his version of reality pressing against mine. The quiet that followed felt unfamiliar at first, then strangely addictive. I changed my routine, took extra hours at work, started going back to the gym regularly, slept better than I had in months. It was not instant healing. It was simply the first time in a long while that my life felt like it belonged entirely to me. And once that feeling arrived, I didn't want to hand it back. By the end of the week, the noise came back through other people. Mutual friends started reaching out, each one pretending to be casual about it. Hey, are you and Caleb okay? He seemed stressed. He said things got blown out of proportion. I kept my answer the same every time. He asked for space. I gave it to him. I never raised my voice, never added detail. I didn't need to. The truth was simple enough to stand on its own. But what I didn't say was what made it powerful. Space has weight. And when you remove yourself from a life that leans on you, the collapse is never immediate. It comes in stages. A few days later, my sister called. She almost never involved herself in my relationships, which is how I knew this had gotten messy. He's telling people you ghosted him, she said, her voice edged with disbelief. Ghosted, I repeated, almost laughing. Interesting word for a man who asked for distance and got exactly that. Apparently, Caleb had been giving people a carefully edited version of events. He told them he was only trying to be honest, that he had needed time to think, that I panicked, packed up, and disappeared before he had a chance to explain. What he left out, of course, was the part where honesty came with a backup plan. The part where Sophie had already known what he was going to say before I heard it in my own living room. I learned more than I expected through mutual friends. People talk more than they realize when they think they're being discreet. Someone who worked in the same building as Caleb mentioned that he and Sophie had been taking lunch together a lot. Another friend said they had seen the two of them leaving work late more than once. No one said anything dramatic. No one had proof of some grand affair. They didn't need to. Emotional betrayal rarely arrives wearing a label. Sometimes it looks like private jokes, timing, subtle loyalty shifts, and one woman knowing exactly when a man has finally said the thing he has been rehearsing. A week after I blocked him, I unblocked his number. Not because I missed him, not because I wanted closure, only because I didn't want him using my silence as evidence that I had been cruel. The second I did, my phone buzzed. It was almost immediate. Finally. We need to talk. This whole thing has gotten out of hand. I stared at the screen and felt nothing but distance. Out of hand. Another phrase designed to flatten everything into a misunderstanding instead of what it really was. A man trying to keep one door half open while peeking through another. I replied with one sentence. You said you weren't sure you wanted me. I made that decision easier for you. His answer came fast, as if he had been holding the phone the entire time. That's not fair. I just needed time. Time. Time to compare. Time to test. Time to see whether Sophie felt more exciting when she was no longer theoretical. I didn't ask for details. I didn't argue. I didn't explain why I left. Instead, I typed, I'm not waiting anymore. That was when the tone changed again. So you're really doing this? After everything? Everything. Such a convenient word. Vague enough to carry guilt. Empty enough to avoid accountability. I muted the conversation and went on with my day. What Caleb still did not understand was that his entire plan had depended on my predictability. He had assumed I would keep paying my share, keep answering his calls, keep occupying the stable role while he explored whether instability might feel more exciting. But real life is not held together by emotional ambiguity. Rent still comes due. Utilities still exist. Routines still depend on the person who has quietly been carrying more than anyone notices. When that person leaves, the math changes fast. The collapse did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened the way most real collapses do, in quiet inconveniences that pile up until they become impossible to ignore. Caleb tried to act normal at first. He posted smiling photos, gym mirror shots, the kind of casual, curated updates people share when they want the world to believe they are thriving. But underneath that performance, the practical details began to crack. Late one evening, he texted me, careful this time. Quick question, did you change the internet password? I looked at the message and felt something close to irony. I had not changed it. I had canceled the account. It had always been in my name. I replied simply, I closed it. There was a longer pause than usual before his next message arrived. Can you send me the info so I can reopen it? I stared at those words for a while before answering. You can open your own account. That was when the frustration sharpened. You don't have to be like this. Like what? Independent, clear, no longer useful on command. A few days later, he asked about the rent, then the power bill, then a shared subscription, then the insurance arrangement he had been leaning on for months. Each message revealed a little more. Not just what I had been handling, but how naturally he had expected me to keep handling it, even after telling me I might not be enough for him anymore. And Sophie. She did not step in. That was the quiet part Caleb had not planned for. Women like Sophie can feel exciting when there is no weight attached. Lunches are easy. Flirting is easy. Being the possible next chapter is easy. But real responsibility changes the atmosphere. Suddenly, it is less fun when the internet is out, the bills are higher, and the person you thought would remain in the background has disappeared entirely. Whatever Caleb had imagined with Sophie, it clearly did not survive contact with real life. He called me one evening after that, the first actual call since I left. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Can we just talk? He asked, and for the first time his voice sounded tired. Not polished, not careful, tired. I didn't expect things to get this messy. I kept my voice calm. You asked for uncertainty. This is what it looks like. He exhaled sharply, and I could hear the frustration rising under the surface. You're punishing me. No, I said. I'm just not fixing things anymore. Silence stretched between us. Then, softer this time, he said the thing that stripped everything else away. I thought you'd wait. There it was. The assumption laid bare. Not love, not regret, expectation. He had counted on my patience the way some people count on electricity, invisible until it's gone. I answered him without raising my voice. I did wait, long enough to realize I didn't want to anymore. Then I ended the call before he could reshape the conversation into something softer, less truthful, easier for him to survive. That night, I felt something close to peace. Not revenge, not triumph. Just the calm that comes when you finally stop carrying something that was never yours to hold alone. Caleb was beginning to discover what happens when the woman he was not sure about stops holding the floor steady beneath him. And from everything I could see, he was only just beginning to fall. The collapse didn't arrive in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded slowly, the way real consequences usually do, in quiet inconveniences that kept stacking on top of each other until Caleb could no longer pretend everything was under control. At first, he tried to keep the same tone in his messages, casual, almost dismissive, as if the entire situation were simply an awkward misunderstanding that time would smooth over. But the longer I stayed gone, the harder it became for him to maintain that illusion. A few days after the call, he texted again late in the evening. "Can we talk in person?" The message looked different from the earlier ones. There was less confidence in it, less of that quiet assumption that I would eventually fold and return to the role he had designed for me. I didn't respond right away. I had learned by then that silence forces people to reveal more than arguments ever could. 20 minutes later, another message appeared. "I'm serious, Clara. This whole thing is getting ridiculous." That word almost made me smile. Ridiculous. As if my leaving had been some dramatic overreaction rather than a simple decision to stop participating in a situation where my value was being evaluated like an optional upgrade. By the second week, mutual friends had started noticing the cracks. One of them mentioned that Caleb had been showing up to gatherings alone and leaving earlier than usual. Another casually mentioned that Sophie had stopped appearing at those same lunches people had been whispering about. Apparently, the excitement of being the potential replacement faded quickly once the man she was orbiting around started having real problems instead of charming conversations. I never asked for details. I didn't need them. When people tell you who they are and what they are doing, the quietest evidence is usually the most reliable. One evening I was finishing a workout when my phone buzzed again. This time the message was shorter. "Can we please just talk?" The word please sat awkwardly there between us, like something Caleb wasn't used to saying when it came to me. I stared at the screen for a moment, considering the possibility of ignoring it entirely. But curiosity has its own gravity, and part of me wanted to see how much of the story he had rewritten for himself. So I replied with 2 words. "About what?" His response came almost instantly. "Everything." That vague answer told me exactly how the conversation would go if I let it. Everything usually means the person speaking hopes to reshape the narrative into something softer, something less direct, something that spreads responsibility evenly across both people. I had no interest in that version of the truth, so I answered simply. "You said you weren't sure about me. I believed you." Several minutes passed before he replied again. When he did, the tone had changed. "You didn't have to leave like that." I set the phone down for a while before responding. It was important that he understood something clearly. Yes, I did. The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, then appeared again as he tried to decide what to say next. Finally, the message arrived. "You made it look like I did something terrible." I read those words twice. The lack of awareness in them was almost impressive. I typed back slowly. "You told me you might want someone else." Another pause followed, longer this time. Then he answered with the sentence that explained everything. "I just wanted time to think." Time to think. Time to compare. Time to explore the possibility of Sophie without closing the door on the life we had built together. What Caleb still couldn't accept was that his version of time had required my life to remain frozen in place while he evaluated my worth, and I was no longer interested in that arrangement. "You had time," I replied. "You used it." A week later, something happened that I hadn't expected. I was finishing a set at the gym when I noticed someone standing near the front desk. He had his phone in his hand but wasn't looking at it. He was watching the entrance. When our eyes met, Caleb straightened slightly, the way people do when they realize the moment they've been waiting for has finally arrived. I wiped my hands with a towel and walked toward the exit. If he had come looking for a scene, he wasn't going to get one. "Hey," he said when I stepped outside into the parking lot. His voice carried that familiar mix of confidence and hesitation that had once made him seem thoughtful. Now it just sounded uncertain. "Hey," I replied. We stood there for a second under the bright fluorescent lights that made everything feel slightly unreal. "You look good," he said. I nodded politely. "You too." It wasn't entirely true. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, more like someone who had been spending a lot of energy trying to hold together a situation that kept slipping through his hands. "Can we talk for a minute?" he asked. "We're talking," I said. He exhaled slowly and rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture I recognized as his way of buying time before saying something uncomfortable. "I didn't think you'd disappear like that," he admitted. "Most people wouldn't." I looked at him calmly. "I know." He frowned slightly. "That's not really a compliment. It's not meant to be." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said the thing I had been expecting since the moment he walked up. "Sophie and I," he began carefully, "it didn't really go anywhere." The sentence floated between us like something he believed should automatically change the outcome of everything that had happened. I nodded once. "I figured." His eyes narrowed slightly. "So you knew?" I shrugged. "I didn't need details. I just listened to what you actually said." He shifted his weight and crossed his arms, the first sign that the conversation wasn't moving the direction he had hoped. "You're acting like you're better than me now," he said. The accusation sounded defensive rather than angry. "I'm not better," I replied calmly. "I just left." That answer seemed to hit harder than any argument could have. His shoulders tightened, and for the first time since the conversation began, he looked directly into my eyes without trying to soften the moment. "I miss you," he said quietly. I believed him, just not in the way he wanted me to. Missing someone and respecting them are two very different things. "You miss the version of me that made your life easier," I said, "not the one standing here now." His jaw clenched, and I could see frustration flicker across his face. "So that's it," he said. "You're just done." I nodded once. I stopped waiting. He let out a short, bitter laugh. "You think you're going to do better than this." I met his gaze without raising my voice. "I already am." That answer ended the conversation more effectively than any dramatic speech could have. Caleb stood there for another second, as if trying to find something that might reopen the door he had closed months earlier. When nothing came to him, he turned and walked back toward his car without another word. I watched him go, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a strange clarity. The hardest part of leaving someone is not the moment you walk away. It is the moment they finally realize you meant it. As I walked back into the gym, something inside me felt lighter than it had in a long time. Caleb had finally seen what my silence meant. Not punishment, not revenge. Just the quiet reality that the woman he had once expected to wait indefinitely had moved forward without him. And once someone truly understands that, there is nothing left to negotiate. After that night at the gym, I assumed the story between Caleb and me had finally reached its natural ending. There had been no yelling, no dramatic confrontation, no desperate attempt to reopen the past. Just a quiet conversation under harsh lights, and the unmistakable realization that we were no longer standing in the same place emotionally. For a while, life returned to something that felt calm and ordinary. I focused on work, on rebuilding routines that belonged entirely to me, on friendships that had quietly grown stronger during the months I had been figuring out how to move forward. But stories rarely close as neatly as we expect them to. A few months later, an invitation arrived in my mailbox. It was from a mutual friend from college who was getting married in late September, the kind of wedding that pulls together overlapping circles of people who once shared the same phase of life. Friends, acquaintances, former roommates, and inevitably, people you once thought would remain permanent parts of your world. I stared at the invitation longer than necessary, already knowing what it meant. Caleb's name would be somewhere on that guest list. For a moment, I considered declining. Not because I was afraid of seeing him, but because I wasn't sure I cared enough anymore to revisit the past in such a public setting. Then curiosity quietly pushed its way into the decision. I had spent months rebuilding my life in small, steady ways, and part of me wondered what it would feel like to stand in the same room again and realize just how much had changed. The wedding venue was one of those places designed to feel timeless. Soft golden lighting hung from high ceilings, white tablecloths covered round tables arranged neatly across the hall, and a small string quartet played gentle instrumental covers near the entrance. When I walked in, the room buzzed with that familiar energy weddings always carry. The combination of nostalgia, celebration, and people trying to look slightly more elegant than they normally do. I arrived alone, and surprisingly, that detail mattered more than I expected, not because I felt incomplete, but because it meant I wasn't using someone else as a shield. I greeted friends I hadn't seen in months, laughed through familiar conversations, and allowed myself to settle into the atmosphere without scanning the room for one particular face. For most of the evening, Caleb was simply another name that might or might not appear in the crowd. The ceremony passed, dinner was served, and the conversations around the tables drifted between old memories and the predictable wedding jokes about marriage advice. Somewhere between dessert and the first round of drinks at the open bar, the music shifted and people began filling the dance floor. That was when it happened. The moment was almost accidental. I looked up from a conversation with an old college friend just as someone stepped aside in the crowd. Across the room, standing near the edge of the dance floor, Caleb froze mid-step. Not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. His expression shifted the way people's faces do when reality catches them off guard. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. Our eyes met across the room. For a brief moment, everything around us seemed quieter. Not silent, just distant enough that the awareness between us felt sharper than the music playing overhead. Caleb looked surprised more than anything else. Not angry, not hurt. Surprised, as if part of him had believed he might never see me again outside the controlled environment of memory. I held his gaze for the second longer than politeness required, then nodded once in acknowledgement. It wasn't smug or cold, just a simple recognition that we both understood exactly what this moment represented. He nodded back automatically, though the movement looked slightly delayed, like his mind was still catching up to what his eyes had already processed. Then he looked away quickly and turned back toward the group of people he had been standing with, pretending to laugh at something someone beside him said. I didn't approach him. I didn't need to, because in that brief exchange I could already see what was happening behind his eyes. The quiet comparison, the mental calculation people make when they finally encounter the version of someone they lost, after convincing themselves the outcome wouldn't matter that much. I returned to my conversation and allowed the evening to continue naturally, moving between the dance floor and the bar with the same relaxed energy I had carried since arriving. Later, one of our mutual friends leaned toward me while we were standing near the drinks table. He's been watching you all night, she whispered, with the kind of half-amused curiosity people reserve for situations they know have history attached to them. I smiled lightly and lifted my glass. I hope he's having fun, I said. And I meant it, because by that point, the situation no longer felt like something that belonged to me. The truth was, the power of that evening didn't come from anything I said or did. It came from what Caleb was seeing with his own eyes. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't circling the room hoping for his attention. I wasn't waiting for some emotional conclusion that would validate the pain of the past. I was simply living my life in the same room where our story had once been unfinished. That realization has a way of settling into people slowly. As the night continued, the dance floor grew more crowded and the music louder. At some point, I caught another glimpse of Caleb across the room. He was standing with a group of people, smiling politely, but the focus of his attention kept drifting in my direction. Not obviously enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to recognize the pattern. Eventually, the moment I had expected arrived. Weddings have a strange gravitational pull. No matter how large the room is, people who share unfinished history eventually find themselves pulled into the same orbit. It happened near the bar, toward the end of the night. I was mid-conversation with an old friend when I felt that familiar sensation, the quiet awareness that someone was standing just slightly too close to be accidental. When I turned, Caleb was there, holding a drink he clearly hadn't taken a sip from yet. "Hey," he said. His voice sounded softer than I remembered, less certain than the one that had once told me he wasn't sure about me. "Hey," I replied. For a moment we stood there while the music filled the space between us. He glanced down briefly at my hand, almost automatically, probably expecting to see someone else's fingers lace through mine. When he didn't, something flickered across his face. Relief, maybe. Or hope. It disappeared almost immediately. "You look different," he said. I smiled slightly. "You've said that before." He laughed nervously and shook his head. "I mean it in a good way." "I know," I said. He shifted his weight and looked around the room before meeting my eyes again. "I heard you moved." "I did." "And work's going well?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation casual. "It is." Each answer I gave was short, complete, leaving nothing hanging in the air for him to pull on. He took a breath before speaking again. "I think about you sometimes," he said quietly, "about how things ended. I nodded once. I figured. His eyes searched my face for something, maybe anger, maybe regret, maybe the smallest signal that the door he once closed might still exist somewhere. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if—" he began. "No," I said gently. The word stopped him completely. Not harsh, not dismissive, just honest. "Oh," he said after a moment. I could see the realization settling across his expression. This wasn't a conversation about reopening the past. I wasn't standing there guarding a position. I had already stepped off the board entirely. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said quietly. "I know," I replied, "but intent doesn't change impact." We stood there for another moment, both of us understanding something that didn't need to be explained out loud. Then Caleb gave a small, tired smile. "I'm glad you're doing well," he said. "I am too," I answered. And for the first time since our story began unraveling, those words felt completely uncomplicated. Caleb stood there for another moment after I answered him, like someone who had reached the end of a conversation he had expected to last much longer. The music from the dance floor spilled around us, laughter rising from nearby tables, glasses clinking, as people celebrated the beginning of someone else's life together. In the middle of all that noise, the space between us felt strangely quiet. He nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something that had finally become impossible to deny. "I'm glad you're doing well," he repeated, his voice softer this time. I smiled lightly. "I am," I said again. And that was the truth that surprised me the most. Months earlier, I would have thought hearing his voice again would stir up old feelings, old questions, the lingering ache of a relationship that ended without the clean closure people imagine when they say goodbye. But standing there in that moment, I didn't feel any of that. What I felt instead was distance. Not the painful kind, the peaceful kind. Caleb hesitated for another second, like he was considering saying something else, something heavier that might shift the tone of the conversation back toward the past. But whatever words had crossed his mind never made it to his lips. Instead, he gave a small nod, turned slightly, and stepped away from the bar. I watched him disappear into the moving crowd of people on the dance floor. For a moment, his figure blended with everyone else in the room, just another guest in a dark suit, laughing with strangers under warm lights. Then he was gone completely, absorbed by the celebration around him. And that was when something finally clicked inside me. Closure doesn't always come from long conversations. It doesn't require apologies, explanations, or dramatic speeches about regret. Sometimes closure arrives quietly in a crowded room when the person who once underestimated you finally sees the life you built without them and realizes there is no longer a place for them inside it. The rest of the wedding blurred together after that moment. I danced with friends, laughed at old stories, and stayed longer than I originally planned, simply because I was enjoying the night. There was no tension pulling my attention toward the door, no silent anticipation about whether Caleb might return for another conversation. He didn't, and that felt right. When I finally stepped outside near the end of the evening, the air had cooled and the parking lot was mostly empty. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, letting the quiet settle around me. My mind drifted back to the night everything had changed. The couch, the muted television, Caleb's voice saying the sentence that once felt like a crack opening beneath my feet. "I'm not sure you're the woman I want right now." At the time, those words had sounded like uncertainty. Now I understood them differently. They weren't uncertainty. They were a test. A test Caleb assumed I would fail by waiting, by staying close enough to remain useful while he figured out whether someone else might make him happier. But the truth about waiting is something people rarely talk about honestly. Waiting doesn't make you loyal. Waiting doesn't make you patient. Sometimes waiting just means shrinking yourself into a placeholder while someone else decides how much of your life they want to keep. And I had almost done exactly that. Leaving had never been about punishing Caleb or proving a point. I didn't pack my car to teach him a lesson. I left because staying would have meant accepting a version of love that required me to pause my life while someone else evaluated my worth. The right people don't ask you to do that. The right people don't keep you nearby while they explore other possibilities. They don't need a safety net while they decide whether you're enough. A few weeks after the wedding, one of our mutual friends mentioned casually that Caleb was moving to another city. Apparently, he had accepted a job somewhere farther away, somewhere new. Fresh start, she called it. I hoped he found one. Not because I still carried feelings for him, but because people rarely grow without friction. And the past year had given both of us more than enough of that. As for me, life continued moving forward in the quiet, steady way real change usually does. New routines replaced the old ones. New friendships formed naturally. The constant tension of wondering whether someone truly valued me disappeared from my life, like background noise finally switching off. Sometimes late at night, I still think about that moment on the dance floor when Caleb and I first saw each other again. Not with regret, just with recognition. Because in that single glance, we both understood the same thing at the exact same time. The woman who once said she would wait had never actually been waiting at all. She had been choosing herself. And that choice didn't come with arguments, ultimatums, or dramatic goodbyes. It arrived quietly, with a packed car, a closed apartment door, and the calm certainty that the right people never ask you to pause your life while they decide whether you deserve it.